How many true dyed-in-the-wool folk horror games can you name? What comes to mind first is the village section from Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I think it's a pretty solid encapsulation of the vibe in video game form. Though once you start running around labs and stuff, the vibe kinda dies off quicker than a gamer's interest when he tries to look up Ashley's skirt in the remake. Maybe something like Fatal Frame or Sony Siren series would fit. I've heard the same about the Polish-produced game Darkwood, which looks awesome, but I've failed to try to play it purely because the top-down perspective makes me feel like I'm watching an ant farm. But I can't think of many video games that have set out with the specific goal of capturing that folk horror aesthetic and feeling. But what am I even talking about? Folk horror is kind of hard to define. On surface level, you could say it's horror that incorporates elements from folklore, but that's not a great definition considering that would make Leprechaun 5 in the Hood a folk horror movie. I would say it might be easier to think of folk horror as media that hits a certain set number of traits, and don't get mad at me because this is an off-the-cuff I'm the snuggler criterion, and I'm sure you could poke plenty of holes in it. I'd say folk horror is typically in a rural or isolated setting, usually with the protagonist being an outsider. The horror has to do with belief, be it folk belief or genuine religion. It's not something that appears out of nowhere, but rather that figures within the belief system of the local region. The horror isn't always supernatural, but often is. There has to be a strong human element. The narrative is moved along by human actors, whether they're leery locals, underground cults, and unwitting victims, so the neurosis, fears, and inner desires of characters are important. And lastly, works of folk horror tend to be slow burns, really reticent with unraveling too much of the local secrets until near the end. That's just my opinion, though. The term was originally applied to films, and though it has existed for a while, the idea really caught on with a Mark Gatiss-produced horror documentary in which he defines the three original and most influential pieces of folk horror as the 60s, 70s British films Blood on Satan's Claw, Witchfinder General, and The Wicker Man. Now, far be it from me to disagree with the man responsible for my least favorite episode of Doctor Who, but Witchfinder General sticks out from the rest like a sore thumb. But that's a digression for another day. Regardless, I think folk horror is seen as a very British genre, which is fair, especially when we look at the genre's literary forebears like Arthur Machen and M.R. James. Few people do creepy, inbred villagers better than The Cursed Island, both in fiction and in real life. But I think folk horror has come into its own in America, the home of the Salem witch trials and the birthplace of the modern cult, as well as in Japan, a land littered with forgotten shrines and esoteric religious beliefs. Now, in my intro, I brought up the idea of folk horror video games, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. The 2022 point-and-click adventure game, The Excavation of Hob's Barrow, developed by British game studio Cloak & Dagger Games. Now, the term folk horror, which I'm sure you're sick of hearing at this point in the video, is plastered all over this game's marketing material like acne on a natural bodybuilding influencer's back. Let's see how successful the game is as a self-branded folk horror adventure game, shall we? In the game, we play as Thomasina Bateman, an amateur archaeologist and antiquarian. The game is set in what seems like smack dab in the middle of England's Victorian era in a small, isolated village somewhere in central England called Bewlay, or Bewlay, as the locals pronounce it. Thomasina is a self-proclaimed barrow digger, and she is visiting Bewlay to dig up a local site called Hob's Barrow in order to include it in the book she is writing, Vestiges of the Antiquities in Rural England. Now, you might not know what a barrow is, or perhaps you only know them from that one section from Fellowship, which somehow didn't make it into the Peter Jackson movie despite being the coolest part of the book. A barrow is essentially an earthen mound built over a gravesite which houses human remains and various objects of tribute. Burial mounds like this can be found quite literally all over the world, but I think the word barrow is probably most associated with those found in the British Isles. The UK has tons of these, many built by the Anglo-Saxons during the early Dark Ages, but also built by the same mysterious peoples living in England for tens of thousands of years before, the same people who raised Stonehenge and saw the arrival of Roman ships. Around the 19th century, digging up these barrows to see what was beneath became an accepted practice in England among the upper academic classes. In fact, Thomasina Bateman's name is borrowed from the famous barrow digger Thomas Bateman, whose book Vestiges of the Antiquities of Derbyshire has a title a lot like our hero's. For a country very small in size but deep in human history like England, barrow digging offered a chance to reconnect with ancient heritage and rediscover a forgotten era of history. But you can find some weird stuff playing around in graves and buried bones, like a tablet dedicated to the Roman god Nodens found in Hampshire that called upon the vengeance of the god for a stolen ring that had been found a century earlier, 80 miles away. Or the Thetford Hoard, a treasure trove of jewelry and luxurious goods left by the people who were cultural hybrids of ancient Rome and Britain. The goods are emblazoned with images of Roman and British pagan gods, though a small signet ring stands out. On it is a figure of a god with the head of a rooster, the body of an armored man, and the necks of slithering serpents for legs, inscribed with the words Abraxas Sabaoth. Anyway, Thomasina arrives in high spirits to excavate the barrow, though a seemingly retrospective monologue narrating events has a much less cheerful tune. She was invited by a local named Leonard Shoulder to excavate Hob's Barrow, a place apparently steeped in local legend. But she has some trouble with the locals, and I'm not just talking about the drunk guy outside the inn who asked for a kiss. Locals either warn you to go back to London or tell you they've never heard of the barrow in their life, like the inn proprietor Stanley Kemp. Once you secure a room, you change out of the stuffy Victorian wool dress into this khaki archaeologist outfit, which I thought was a cute little moment in establishing Thomasina as a character. Anyways, you chill around the inn, waiting for Mr. Shoulder to show up, but the hours pass and he's still a no-show. Anyways, as you wait, the drunk guy from earlier, Arthur Tillett, comes into the bar, and despite initially sexually harassing you, he's kind of a nice guy, though definitely a degenerate alcoholic.
I felt bad for how I spoke to you. I'm sorry. The drink gets a hold of me sometimes.
Arthur says he'll tell you more about the Barrow and Mr. Shoulder if you buy him a drink, but before he begins, he insists on running to the bathroom. When he doesn't show, you barge into the loo, and God, I know it smells crazy in here.
Smells like pee-pee and poo-poo in here.
There's not a sign of Arthur, though, just this creepy old stinky cat. Anyways, with no sign of Mr. Shoulder, a dejected Thomasina goes to bed and doesn't exactly have the best night's sleep. Anyways, after a bad night of sleep, you wake up ready to find the elusive Mr. Shoulder. Mr. Kemp reveals that nobody was in your room last night, though the stinky gray cat is a feline resident of the inn called Herbert. He also tells you that he was actually lying when he said he didn't know about Hob's Barrow.
I like to run an honest establishment. And well, I have not been honest with you, lass. I do know of Hob's Barrow.
You do?
He said most of the villagers do, but he advises us to abandon our mission and to be especially cautious of Leonard Shoulder, the no-show from last night who invited us here. Anyways, with no signs of Mr. Shoulder or idea where the Barrow is, Thomasina takes the time to explore the village. The town of Bewlay is incredible, perfectly towing the line between cozy and dreary. There's something comfortable but also slightly melancholic about it, and the graphics are just nostalgic perfection. I love the backgrounds in the town square, and the more we see, the more we realize the people who designed the backgrounds were close to magicians, especially when it comes to the lonely bleakness of the moors or the leafy sun-dappled forests. The game also alternates between typical adventure game perspective and close-ups. Some are static, but some are these cool cutscenes that seem rotoscoped, though I don't know if they are. There's something disquieting about the weird fluidity of the cat as it stalks across the floor. That's all to say that visually the game is impressive as hell. There are some things that are less impressive out of the gate though. The walking animations are good, if not a little fast when it comes to other characters. Also, when Thomasina is walking away perpendicular to the foreground, the animation gets very weird. This was incredibly jarring at first, but gets more and more funny as you play, and Thomasina just absolutely clips it across the screen, walking sideways like she's hitting the slick back at cheetah speeds. Every character is fully voiced and the performances themselves are great. The locals all have that northern English accent that to my American ears sounds like a mix of Scottish and English and makes me think of salad fingers. This is probably a reflection of how little I play games with this much voice acting, but it almost seemed too good at times. Like the characters take their sweet time with their performances, so a lot of the game is waiting for the characters to finish their lines. This is a problem for me as I have the patience of an overactive Labrador who just heard the letters W-A-L-K spoken out loud, but I was often skipping through the lines when I read the words on screen, which led to a lot of clipped, awkward pauses.
Grave robber, are you?
Not at all. I merely have an interest.
Not much to be found in. You're better off waiting for the next train.
I'll take my chance.
Anyways, a very personal complaint, so take it with a huge grain of salt. As we meet more people, we get a fuller idea of Thomasina as a character. As a protagonist, Thomasina is a very, well-rounded character. She's got to be one of my favorite adventure game characters. Okay, I'm sorry, but in my defense, I looked through the game's art book and the developers toned her down from the originally criminally horny design. Thomasina's pursuit as a barrow digger, and even her entire life outlook, is shaped by her father, a notable archaeologist and barrow digger that Thomasina is carrying the proverbial trowel from. Her father is currently in a coma from a mysterious illness that happened in her youth, so her entire impression of the man is a very rose-tinted time capsule from her girlhood. We get occasional flashbacks to Thomasina's memory with her father, where he planned barrow digging inspired games for her. Her father was an incredibly rational scientific man who hated supernatural hogwash, a term that Thomasina often borrows, along with his exclamation of capital. This relationship with her sick father means a lot to Thomasina and is her main driver as a character. Not only is the practice of barrow digging an activity she learned to love from her father, it also seems to be the main way she can hold on to her relationship and feel close with him in his current state.
I've decided that is what I want to do with my life. I'm going to travel the country, excavating and documenting my own finds. Well, as soon as I'm old enough to escape mother, that is. When you're feeling better, we can go out on expeditions together again, just like we used to.
We get the feeling that her memories of her father are so limited, she structured her entire life to hold on to the ones she does have, which mainly revolve around barrow digging. That said, Thomasina can come across as very preachy when she rails against supernatural hogwash, though that's definitely par for the course for folklore protagonists who don't respect the world of the supernatural until it is too late. She also has the typical adventure game protagonist alley cat morals, which is to say she is a mostly heroic person who is not above acting like a complete psycho. Like, she'll refuse to get someone's white glove dirty by touching the ground, but will pick a lock or pawn someone's valuable necklace she found at the drop of a hat. Which is not a criticism at all. I love my adventure game protagonists with a hint of the Brent Halligan about them. As you talk to the villagers, you find Arthur, who, though apologetic, says he doesn't remember anything, was just pulling your leg about having inside info on Mr. Shoulder.
So what were you going to tell me?
I don't really know the old bugger.
But you said you did.
Oh, aye. No, I know. No, not about Leonard Shoulder.
Sounds very believable. Anyways, you meet some interesting characters around town, like this creepy taciturn gravedigger and the grumpy old man Cyril Farnaby, who hates outsiders, but like in a somewhat endearing way. As expected, no one seems all too willing to share much with you about Hob's Barrow or Mr. Shoulder, who lives outside of town on the moors. Although this is suspicious in some ways, in others it's not. There's not necessarily this big conspiracy in town to keep you from knowing the truth. Some people are just going on with their lives. Like the blacksmith, Mr. Crozier, whose ignorance about the barrow likely lies in the fact that he's just a normal dude who's too busy to care. Or the sweet old church lady, Mrs. Duplancy, who simply doesn't concern herself with the barrow and wants you to do the same. It would be like if someone went up to you in the street of the city you live and asked for everything you knew about some allegedly haunted house across town. It makes Bewlay feel more like a lived-in normal small town where not everything relates back to the local creepy attraction. Eventually we find the local vicar, Father Roach, in the woods, not doing too hot. Despite the bad first impression, the vicar's a nice dude who loves gardening and quoting Shakespeare. He offers to take us to Mr. Shoulder's house across the moor, and as we're walking, he tells us about primitive folk who live on the moors and are apparently godless. At Mr. Shoulder's house, nobody's home and you're forced to return to town. There, from various locals, you learn about Lord Panswick, the governor of the county, who doesn't seem like too nice of a bloke.
What do you know about Lord Panswick?
Wretched man. They say he is restoring a chapel near his manor. But for whom and to what god, I ask?
There's mentions of him having trespassers shot and restoring a chapel on his estate that doesn't sound too Christian. Anyways, after doing her a favor, a little girl finally tells you where the barrow is, on the land of a farmer named Samuel Bryden. Bryden is a gruff but kind-seeming old man who flatly refuses to allow you to excavate the barrow, explaining that he never told Mr. Shoulder to reach out to you in the first place. See, back in the day, there was an earlier excavation of Hob's Barrow led by 3 men, one of whom was Mr. Bryden's brother. Although he never found out what he saw, Bryden's brother returned with one of his hands completely missing, and was so haunted by what he saw that he committed suicide not long after. So after all the work, we can't even dig up the barrow, which is quite disappointing, though Mr. Bryden does at least let you look at it. After all the intrigue and secrecy, the barrow seems fairly benign. This is probably a decent place to stop for spoilers. Skip to the timestamp on screen if you want to play the game and experience the story alone, but please do come back later after you finish the game. Also, if you're liking the video, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. It helps the channel immensely. Plus, if I get to 5K subscribers by the end of the year, your parents told me they might get back together, so there's your incentive. Anyways, realizing we've been led on a bit of a fool's errand, we head back to the inn and drown our sorrows with Arthur, and the two of you trauma bond about your dead parents. That night, Thomasina has another bad dream. She finds herself back at the barrow, but lit by an eerie purple moon and with giant mountains in the background that clearly weren't there last time. At the barrow, we find this creepy, deformed monster that has the same face as Herbert the cat had in our first dream. In a surprisingly chadly voice, he tells you that he was the one who saved our father, and that our father was on the earlier excavation with Mr. Bryden. He tells us that he can save our father again and promises proof in the morning.
One more thing. This is not a dream.
When we wake, we find a journal and a stone with the head of a rooster carved into it. The journal itself is pretty inscrutable, mentioning visiting a wise woman and other esoteric gibberish. When we asked Stanley about it, he says he didn't see anyone bring the journal to your room, but that the wise woman might be Mother Mildred Walker, a folk healer who lives in the woods outside of town. Anyways, we pay a visit to Mother Mildred and have a bit of a surprise.
I recognised you the moment I laid eyes on you at the station.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, yeah, it's quite a striking family resemblance. You have your father's eyes, Miss Bateman.
Not only does Mother Mildred tell us she knew our father, but she also claims that he was one of the 3 men on the earlier expedition. Thomasina realizes that the journal she found that morning with the esoteric instructions belonged to her father. We learn that not only did our father believe in magic, but that he practiced it himself. In fact, he asked for Mother Mildred to instruct him in binding magic for the excavation. She warns us to stay far, far away from the barrow after what happened to Bryden's brother and her father, and using childhood memories, we put 2 and 2 together, that the accident that caused your father's coma happened the exact time he was in Bewlay excavating the barrow. So not only do we learn that without realizing it, we're following in our father's footsteps, but that our image of the man is completely wrong. Although he told us not to believe superstitious hogwash, he was more of an occultist than an archaeologist. There's some great foreshadowing to this, like when Thomasina is telling the priest about her father's sickness and says,
What sort of god would allow this fate to befall such a kind and honest man?
Well, her father definitely wasn't an honest man to his own daughter at least, and the god that allowed his fate probably wasn't the one Father Roche preaches about. Anyways, now we know the first 2 men on the expedition, but still not the third. Right on time, after 2 days of fruitless searching, you run into Mr. Shoulder himself. He explains he gave you the cold shoulder, get it? Because he was laid up in bed with fever, and that he had no clue your father was on the original dig. He gives us more of an idea of why the villagers didn't want us to dig up the Barrow. Apparently 25 years earlier, before the other expedition, the village went through a period of great hardship, the blame of which fell on the goblin that people believed lived in the Barrow, a creature named Saxnot, who allegedly put a curse on the land. The original expedition sought, in part, to stop the goblin's curse, and by all metrics they were successful as the hardship ended. Shoulder tells us the villagers believe that disturbing the Barrow would bring back the goblin's curse, though he doesn't seem to believe it at all. The implication here is that Thomasina's father was part of this undertaking to stop the curse using magic. Anyways, Leonard Shoulder urges us to continue to excavate the Barrow. The whole interaction is very sketchy though. He seems really to be playing on Thomasina's vanity to get his way, emphasizing how smart and capable she is, and how she wouldn't let local superstition stop her. Plus, his story about being sick with fever is about as believable as when I told my mom that I never ate the lunch she packed me because I was never hungry at lunchtime, and not because I spent the whole period in the bathroom stall because I didn't have any friends to sit with. Anyways, we show the stone with the cock's head we found to Mr. Bryden, and he brings out a similar one, this one featuring 2 snake heads and spells out Sax in Greek. He tells us his brother brought it back with him from the first expedition. He finally relents and begrudgingly gives us permission to excavate. Now all you have to do is get a crew of men to help you out. The 2 stones, one with a rooster head and the other with 2 snakes, are interesting. Paired with a flashback scene where Thomasina's mother is frantically burning her father's papers after the accident, they revealed to me the central mystery of the secret of Hob's Barrow. While helping her mother burn the papers, the young Thomasina reads a word that starts with Abraxas. Now bear with me because things are about to get weird and I'm by no means an expert in any of this stuff. You might have heard of something called Gnosticism before, which isn't really religion but more a set of specific esoteric religious beliefs that went around in the very, very early days of Christianity. It was an era not long after the death of Jesus Christ, when there was far from homogeneity in the church's teachings. From what I can gather, the main defining trait of Gnosticism is belief in the power of knowledge, hidden knowledge specifically. Gnostics pursued hidden spiritual knowledge rather than the rules and morals of our material universe, which were seen as too worldly or sometimes even evil. The main conflict of Gnostic belief doesn't come from good versus evil as in most religions, but rather from truth versus lies, the spiritual versus the physical. According to ancient sources, one specific Gnostic group, the Basilidians based out of Egypt, placed specific emphasis on a divine figure called Abraxas or Abraxas. Now, because early Gnostic texts were rooted out and destroyed by early church fathers, we know very little about Abraxas from the Basilidians, what his role is, or even whether he was good or evil, though he was later classified as a demon by the Catholic Church. What we do know is that Abraxas proved very, very popular. Across the ancient world, in stones, rings, and jewelry, we find mention of Abraxas' name. What's even stranger is the depiction of the god itself, a creature with the head of a rooster, the body of a man bedecked in a Greek breastplate, holding a whip and a shield in either hand, and with the necks of 2 serpents for legs. Why do we find this stone with this name and figure everywhere from Egypt to England? Because, as I mentioned earlier, an Abraxas stone was found in the Thetford Hoard, dug up in England in 1979. How did the shadowy Gnostic god or demon find its way to Norfolk? Truly, we don't know. Maybe images of Abraxas were protective charms, maybe used in magical spells, maybe had a much more worldly significance as a metaphor or symbol. Regardless, the meaning behind Abraxas is and likely will remain hidden, meant to be an esoteric secret for the learned few. I think that might be the best way to think of Abraxas, as a lord of hidden truths, a personification of forbidden lore. This, though, is who the developers chose to make the big bad villain behind the folk horror happenings in Hob's Barrow. Not a god they made up or borrowed like Cthulhu or even some Celtic god from pagan Britain, but Abraxas, a mysterious god whose tendrils ran across the entirety of the ancient world. I think that's honestly awesome. The figure of Abraxas is as mysterious in the fictional world of Bewlay as it is in our real world. There's something incredibly creepy about him, that he's found in all these stones and magical objects from across the antique world, yet we know so little. Plus, I'll be honest, initially when you look at him, he looks kind of goofy, like someone threw a bunch of disparate elements together and calls it a day. But the more you think about it, it is kind of horrific. The head of a screeching cockerel, the body of a man in shining metal armor, and 2 writhing, hissing serpents where the legs should be. It's kind of horrifying in how odd and grotesque it is. While working on this video, I spent so much time reading about him and seeing image after image and thinking about what he'd look like in real life, I found myself getting genuinely disturbed. Anyways, we now have to enlist workers to help us dig. There's more shenanigans on this day, like cutting off a horse's tail, juggling wormy apples, and finding the neighborhood milkman rehearsing for the community theater production of Midsommar. Remember the local bigwig, Lord Panswick, I mentioned? Well, throughout the game, Thomasina has been running into this well-dressed guy who seems incredibly creepy and sinister, but she's like weirdly into. You know, we can all relate to the hot person we're interested in dropping lines like,
Don't fret, my dear. You shall be the shining star of my new world. When the time comes, I shall call on thee.
Anyways, this guy is the godless heathen Lord Panswick, who was restoring a pagan chapel on his grounds and allegedly having trespassers shot. Anyways, Panswick allows us to use his laborers and gives a supervillain speech that Thomasina doesn't notice how scary it is, probably because just being around him is getting her bloomers wet.
This sacred place rebuilt, he shall be venerated once more, and the name Panswick shall be uttered again across all of England. He guided the hands of my ancestors. Now it is time for him to guide us. Bewlay is a godless place.
Back to Thomasina as a character. I do think she's a really interesting protagonist with an all-in-all cool vibe. The Victorian archaeologist adventuress is a very cool character. She reminds me of a color-swapped version of the protagonist from that cancelled game in the Valley of Gods, which I'm still very sad we never got because the trailer looks sick. But despite lecturing people about superstitious hogwash, she's just so fucking oblivious and gullible. Like how she isn't registering how creepy Panswick is when he says stuff like this.
My truths will surround you in good time.
Probably because she sees him as a member of her own class rather than the local peasantry, or how she gets completely swayed by Shoulder playing on her vanity. And she has this very annoying woe is me attitude in the retrospective narration. Like when she finally browbeats poor Mr. Bryden enough to excavate, she says this.
You failed, and so did Charles Bryden. He should have said no. He should have never given me that stone.
Despite her erudition, she comes across as very naive.
And that's what I admire about you. Tenacity. Even in the face of something you know to be absurd. You don't give up, do you?
When we get back to the inn to get ready for a good night's sleep before the dig, Arthur wants to talk to us. He finally tells us what scared him away the first night.
That night we met, when I vanished. Well, there were a man in the loo. A hooded man. He threatened me with a beating if I told you anything about what I saw.
At first, Arthur didn't realize why he was being threatened, but then a memory came back out of his drunken haze of a conversation he overheard between Panswick and Leonard Shoulder.
Are you sure that it must be her blood?
Aye, she's family.
We must bring her to the site as soon as she arrives.
No. Your lordship, with all due respect, we've been through this. We need to ease her into the idea. She would laugh in our faces if we just asked for it.
Who said we would ask?
He told me that she needs to give it willingly.
But right on cue, Panswick shows up and threatens Arthur away. He tells you to dismiss what we heard as the ravings of a crazy drunk, and Thomasina seems much less concerned than she should be. We learn, shocker, that we were lured here by Shoulder and Panswick to appease some sort of god, who we know to be Abraxas, and that this god, once restored, will heal the ills of his true followers like Mr. Shoulder. We have a final dream at the Barrow with the goblin Saxnot, where he explains more of our father's involvement. Again, Thomasina is toyed with by being told that saving Saxnot from the botched spell will also save our father. We know from the journal and Mother Mildred that Thomasina's father used a binding magic spell in the Barrow, but was it actually botched or working as intended?
You need to enter this barrow and undo what your father did. The spell must be undone. Then not only will I regain my strength, but your father will too.
We finally come to the day of the excavation. As we leave to head to the Barrow, we're intercepted by Father Roach and the local grumpy old man, Cyril Farnaby, who implore us to leave town.
Miss Bateman, I beg you, in the name of God, leave this town.
Father Roach, what is the meaning of this?
Father Roche, Mr. Farnaby, here to wish Miss Bateman good luck for her excavation, gentlemen.
Am I heck? Mr. Kemp, you know...
An excavation strongly supported by Lord Panswick, no less.
I wish you well with your findings, Miss Bateman. May the Lord strengthen you and guard you from the evil one.
The innkeeper Stanley Kemp is an interesting character. This action of scaring away these two casts him on the side of the cultists, but on the first day he also told us to leave town and forget we ever heard of the Barrow or Mr. Shoulder. Why the change of tune? Was he threatened or coerced? Or was his original warning all part of the game to play on our pride to get us to stay? On the way to the Barrow, we find the last Abraxas stone at Mr. Shoulder's house, revealing what we probably already guessed, that he was the third man on the excavation with her father. When we show up to the Barrow, we find Lord Panswick's men ready to assist us. Before we dig into the heart of Hob's Barrow, now might be a good time to talk about the game's narrative influences. I mentioned earlier that folk horror is a very cinematic genre, and you definitely feel echoes of the big three folk horror films here. Like the name of the village inn, The Plough and the Furrow, seems to be referenced to the fantastic opening scene of Blood on Satan's Claw, my personal favorite of the big three. But I would argue that the influence actually isn't too strong, and in fact, other games I've covered on the channel may have more in common with them. Instead, I think the influence behind the game are much more literary than cinematic. The moment I knew I'd like this game is when I saw a gravestone in the church for someone named William Paxton. You see, William Paxton is the protagonist of the story A Warning to the Curious, written by M.R. James. James is both one of my favorite writers of all time and often considered the father of the modern ghost story. His stories, branded antiquarian ghost stories, are absolutely fantastic, but less about ghosts than you might think from the name. Usually the supernatural takes the form of a demon, a wizard's familiar, a monster, or sometimes an entity or creature that defies all explanation. Typically, protagonists in his stories are scholarly outsiders who poke their nose too deep into things they don't understand and risk losing that proverbial nose to the clutches of the uncanny. In A Warning to the Curious, the character Paxton digs up a mound that houses an ancient Anglo-Saxon crown, and the last member of the Ager clan that was meant to protect the crown takes revenge from beyond the grave. Even when Paxton returns the crown, the wrath of the revenant William Ager isn't satisfied until Paxton meets his death in the skeletal clutches of Ager's spirit. Obviously, there's plenty of similarities between the two stories. Both are about an out-of-towner who, despite local warnings of the supernatural, digs up an ancient burial site that was much better left alone. There's plenty of other references to the story in the game too. Would I call M.R. James a folk horror writer after laying out the rules of the genre earlier? Well, he is and he isn't. He wrote some more traditional gothic ghost stories, but a lot of his work hits on some or all of the criterion I set out, like Warning to the Curious. In fact, though this is certainly a folk horror game, I'd say it's equally a Jamesian game. Though, you don't see that on the marketing because probably less than 10 living people know what that means. Even the main villain of the game being Abraxas, a real religious figure from history, feels like a Jamesian twist. James himself was a scholar of history and religion, and his stories are chock full of weird biblical lore and ancient arcana. A Gnostic deity from the ancient world seems straight out of a James story, and indeed, the majority of the game is straight up grounded in religious belief. The stereotypical English folktales about goblins are just a mask for the ancient Gnostic horror leaking beneath. Anyways, I can say that the Excavation of Hob's Barrow is the first Jamesian video game I've ever played, but I certainly hope it isn't the last. We need a boost of Jamesian media in the same way Lovecraft's legacy got inflated by films and games in the last couple decades. Well, maybe not exactly like that. As you can tell, I'm a big M.R. James fanboy and I actually did a grand reread of all of his stuff last summer. So if you're interested in my ranking of each of his stories, check out the Google Doc link in the description. Other literary influences might be Eleanor Scott's Randall's Round, an absolute gem of a Victorian horror story that also features creepy going-ons around a mound in an isolated town and might as well have written the book on folk horror literature. It's a lot more obscure than A Warning to the Curious, so I'm not sure if the devs have read it, but check out Randall's Round if you haven't. I think it's in public domain. Okay, back to the game. When you dig up the barrow and peek inside, you find odd purple flowers growing underground. When you return to the surface, you find the entire work crew has abandoned you.
Chaps? I've been abandoned.
The barrow itself, far from being the usual one-room tumulus, is a catacomb that goes deeper and deeper into the earth. I loved this section so much. It threw all the worldly coziness of the village out the window. It's this creepy, unearthly place. Sprawling semi-Roman halls and tunnels lit by purple lights where the material laws of science are broken, just as the Gnostics who followed Abraxas sought to break from the physical rules of the universe. I don't want to talk about it too much because honestly I found the puzzles really fun and it would be a shame to spoil them, but there's a lot of weird shit down here. There's a ghostly black goat, Samuel Bryden's mummified hand, and even Herbert the cat from the inn somehow found his way all the way down here. I love this unearthly purple light. It's a cool visual cue for Abraxas that repeats later. Also, many of the art and puzzles down here are ripped directly from the actual artifacts in Abraxas stones. Plus, one of the final puzzles is verbatim a real invocation to Abraxas found on an ancient Egyptian papyrus, where you enter doorways that match certain words of the prayer. Another cool detail is this room with all these weird stone animal heads. Each type of animal here matches decorative plates in the village inn, deepening the innkeeper Stanley Kemp's involvement with the Abraxas cult. Anyways, I can't emphasize how much the developers hit it out of the park in this area. As we travel deeper into the barrow, we get some disturbing visions of our father's mortality, his decomposition before our very eyes. These are really creepy and have this dreamlike quality to them. I don't know, I think you could argue there's some psychedelic substance in the barrow causing her to hallucinate, maybe the purple flowers, but I think it's much more interesting to chalk this up to actual visions the sleeping Abraxas is sending us, so we don't back out of our mission to break him from his curse. Finally, we find a monolithic Roman temple in the heart of the barrow, bearing the name and image of Abraxas. Inside, we offer up our blood.
Still scarcely believe what I saw looming over me in that Stygian chamber. How does one even attempt to describe the indescribable? The vision before me defied all logical explanation.
So now we finally reverse the spell our father cast to seal Abraxas and let him loose upon the earth. Personally, I don't like that we never actually see Abraxas. I get they do the whole Lovecraft, OMG, how can I describe the indescribable? But like, the game is such a slow burn, I feel like we earned at least a sighting of him. Even if it's just a super short shadowy glimpse like what they do with the beast at the end of Over the Garden Wall. Anyways, Thomasina runs out of the barrow and encounters Saxnot the Goblin. Saxnot reveals that he was once his own entity, but he's become completely corrupted by Abraxas and effectively become his slave. I think it's fair to say the cat Herbert was Saxnot's weaker physical form manifesting in our world and trying to convince us to break the biting spell.
I deceived you. I'm sorry. I am his now. Soon we'll all be his. Hail Abraxas Rex.
Possessed by Abraxas, you return to the hospital your dad is in and show the nurses your best Victoria Newman from The Boys impression. Before bashing in your comatose father's brains with the same urn you two used to play with on those long ago summer days. This is obviously incredibly grim and violent in a game that wasn't really much of either of those things, so at first I thought it was a bit much. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to work. It shows Abraxas as an incredibly vindictive, petty god, still furious after all these years at Thomasina's father for trapping him. Even though he's not even fully awake to see it, Abraxas kills the father in the most diabolical way possible, using the person who loves him most and a physical symbol of that undying love to end his life. It's pretty bleak stuff. It also reminds me of A Warning to the Curious, where the grave robber Paxton returns the crown to its burial place, but the spirit of its guardian still takes his revenge in the end. It's not over yet, though. We see Lord Panswick welcoming local worshippers to a now restored chapel, including a healed Leonard Shoulder. As we see the same unearthly purple glow from the barrow illuminate the chapel walls, we realize the bad guys got what they wanted. It's now revealed that Thomasina is locked up at the loony bin, probably for the rest of her life, for the murder of her father, with only Arthur Tillett to come to visit. The entire retrospective narration we've been getting from Thomasina is a letter she's been writing to her mother in an attempt to explain everything that happened. She blames her mother for allowing her to believe her father was a rational man of science and not basically a ghost hunter for hire who preached against superstition to his young daughter so she wouldn't follow his footsteps. By hiding the truth from Thomasina, her mother ensured she did exactly that. I can't think of many games I've played outside of Soma with an ending this crushingly bleak.
I only wanted to save my father. Oh, Mother, what have I done? Forgive me.
To me, the Excavation of Hob's Barrow is about the dangers of belief, whether that belief is big or small. Like, yes, believing in an ancient Gnostic deity is probably not a good idea, but so is believing so much in a person that you're blind to their failings and lies. Believing in your life's purpose so much that nothing and nobody can make you question it. Believing in compliments from charming strangers and appeals to personal glory that you don't even consider what the other party is getting in return. Sometimes belief gives us strength to persevere against adversity and evil, but sometimes it ensnares and betrays us. Our world is capricious and cruel and intent on reminding us that we understand much less of it than we think we do. A little pessimism, a little jadedness, a little mistrust can protect us from that. The Excavation of Hob's Barrow is an excellent slow burn experience of folk horror, and a great example of the point-and-click horror adventure game done in the modern era. There are times where I wanted a bit more variety and even honestly a bit more scares, but the character's storyline and atmosphere left me interested in its world until the very end. The devs sought to bring folk horror to the adventure game format, and I think they definitely succeeded. Ultimately, I'm glad I live in a world where games like this exist, and if you know of any others like it, please do recommend them to me. Oh, and also pick up a copy of the collected Ghost Stories of Emma James for me too, okay? I hope you're having a happy October, and I hope that Abraxas Rex will answer all your prayers. That's all for today. Thank you so much for your time, dear viewer. I wish you all the good fortune in the world. I remain your faithful snuggler.